Ben got me addicted to vaping. So, I want to talk about why I am not into watching anime seasonally, why I'm going to try and curb the amount of it that I have been doing, which is not much, and to just kind of explain my thought process. Because, like, every season, throughout the whole season, I always get asked, like, what's your opinion on this show or that show? And I always have to respond, like, I'm not watching it. I don't watch anything while it's airing. I never have. It's not typical of me. I've tried a lot of times, and I've come close a couple of times. The closest I've ever come to watching a show while it was airing was Fate Zero, which I managed to blog the entire show in the span of its runtime. There was a period of like 3 or 4 weeks where I fell behind and had to play catch up. But like, I just don't get it. I don't get why people like stuff, like watching stuff weekly. And then when people actually do explain it to me, like why they like it, it's always reasons that I don't relate to. So I'm going to try to get into that a little bit. So to me, watching a show all at once is the best way to maximize on giving a shit about it, because every time I watch an episode, I'm, more and more excited about where it's going, and I want to see it through to the end, and I want to just watch the whole fucking thing at once. When I have to spend a whole week in between 2 episodes, there is so much stuff that I'm going to do in that week that I'm going to completely forget about that show. Whatever excitement I had is probably going to go out the window, especially if there's ever a slow episode. Like, when you watch something in a marathon, you can kind of look past, like, if there's one episode that maybe is mostly set up for something that's coming later, that it's not that big a deal, But if you watch a show and, a week comes by and the episode's kind of lame, and then you just kind of, that's now your impression of the show for a whole week is, that episode was kind of lame, And then, for me personally, I'll completely forget. If I do anything in that week, sometimes I've had shows where it's like, I went to Otsucon, never gonna get back to that show. I, started writing something big or started marathoning an older show for some reason, never gonna get back to the previous shows, So, to me, it's just like, watching it week by week, there's so many opportunities to stop caring or to forget about it. And, like, you're expected to kind of remember what's going on in a show across 12 to 26 weeks, which can be really hard, especially if you're watching a bunch of other stuff in between, and trying to keep track of who all these characters are and stuff like that, especially in the early episodes when you're not really given to care all that much yet, Like, if I'm on episode 4 and, like, I haven't quite, I'm like enjoying the show, but I'm not like way into it yet, and I don't really remember all the characters that well, or like maybe there were scenes in episode 1 that were important that I've kind of lost track of, and so then something happens in episode 5 that like would be a big, like payoff to something that happened before, but I haven't been thinking about it for 4 weeks, so, I've totally forgotten. That kind of stuff. I think I'm better at that now. Like, I'm a lot better at, like, keeping track of what's going on in a show over a long period of time now than I was before, like, in my youth. But still, like, I just don't see how it's better this way, And there's so few reasons that I see to watch something while it's airing. The main ones that, that come to mind are, one, that you see it at the same time as everyone else. So, for people who care about spoilers, I know that's a big deal. I don't give a single fuck about spoilers. I don't think spoilers are at all hurtful to the experience of a show. And there are even scientific studies to back that, believe it or not. They've done studies to prove that people on average like shows more when they're spoiled for it, because they're not as likely to have their expectations not be met. Because they already know what to expect. So they're more likely to enjoy the show exactly as much as they would have. I don't think that the additional enjoyment that comes from not knowing what's going to happen is worth anything. I don't think it's any bigger of a leap, I feel like a lot of people who care about spoilers haven't tried just watching something they've been spoiled for and realizing that it's the same. Like, hearing the spoiler can be just as shocking as seeing the spoiler, Like, knowing about the show and then hearing this character. Like, there's been some shows that I watched because of the shocking spoiler that I was like, wow, that actually sounds really cool that happens in the show. Now I'm more curious about it, But that all aside, if you just want to be able to be a part of the conversation at ground zero, that's one thing. But I think that the conversation about any show is by far the least interesting while the show is airing. That is the time when everyone's opinions are the most worthless and insipid, and I care the least about them. Because all of it will change by the end of the show. Everything you're saying will be completely irrelevant by the time it's over. You know? And I've been doing the Weebcast each season where we watch all the first episodes and everything. And, like, the reason the Weebcast has to come out within, like, 2 or 3 weeks of the season starting is that by 2 weeks later, those opinions are not worth anything, you know, except as a time capsule to look back on and say, like, wow, that's what we thought it was going to be, you know? So, to me, the whole practice of watching stuff weekly is just kind of weird. It's like, now the other reason to do it is the water cooler. People like to discuss a show, people like to theorize about a show, and I hate that shit. Because I don't want to listen to people's theories about a show. I don't want to listen to people trying to guess what it's going to be, because eventually we're all going to know what it was, and then we can really have an interesting conversation about its themes and what was going on, as opposed to just shots in the dark that don't mean anything in the long run, you know? And to be completely frank, the reason I got into doing this kind of content is because I was sick of forums and sick of discussion culture and sick of the way that discussion is presented in an open forum, because everyone who watches anime has their own perspective. They've got their own ideas about what it's going to be, or what it is, or, like, you know, what they think about it. And the conversation about a show while it's airing is just people talking past each other in every direction. You know, if you go into, like, a Reddit thread or something, most of the people are just writing, like, a review of the show. And then, you know, and Reddit's better about this than most forums I've been to, where people will actually respond to one person's review. Whereas in the forums I used to go on, like something like Anime Suki, you know, a show, people would just, like, write their review, and then the next person would write their review, and there's no actual discussion. And if you don't feel exactly the way that person feels, or, like, have the same perspective as them, then it can be totally useless, you know? Whereas, because I can write a video that, like, presents my whole perspective and is like, here's everything I'm thinking, then we can discuss that perspective, you know, as opposed to people writing their own reviews. And I have had, like, 1 or 2 commenters in the past who will, like, comment on my video with just their review of the show. And I'm like, this has nothing to do with my point, you know? I like this format because we're discussing my point, not everyone just talking past each other, you know? And I think that trying to make a point about a show before it's over, it's just, you don't know the whole story. You don't have all the context yet. And there are things to be said about a show from early on. You know, it's really easy to talk about aesthetic. It's easy to talk about pacing while the show's happening. You know, it's easy to talk about like, just general structure and plot and, like, directing and stuff like that. So, you know, I've had times in the past where I've written, like, a first impressions of a show that were based on things I can get out of the first episodes, you know? And sometimes those are indicative of the whole show. When I wrote about Hibike Euphonium episodes 1 and 2, like, I practically ended up writing what would be a review of the whole show if I had written it, you know, because I, like, made all the points, and the show was always about that. So, you know, it is possible to end up predicting the whole thing, but I could have just as easily have watched the whole show and been able to make those points even more strongly by having, you know, looked into what every character was feeling and thinking, and, you know, and really fleshed it out, as opposed to just being able to look at this old video and say, well, I mean, I was right, but this isn't helpful now because everyone knows that this is what the show's about, you know? It was only interesting at the time because no one was, like, sure, necessarily. So, yeah, it's just weird. I don't get enough out of it. And, like, I'll have these times where I'll talk about a show that I marathoned, and people will tell me, like, well, you watched it marathon. You're supposed to watch it week by week. And I'm like, there's no show that I think is better that way. There's none. There's not a single show that I would prefer to watch week by week. And if there's a show that could actually only be appreciated watching it week by week, I wouldn't like it. I just wouldn't like the show, because watching week by week to me is like torturous and horrible and just not a good idea. And also, why even watch new anime when there's so much great old stuff out there? And again, I know a lot of it is to be a part of the conversation. That's why I end up watching so much new shit, because I run an anime channel and I'm trying to make videos that people will actually watch, and it's a lot harder to do that if you try to talk about an old show. And not just because, you know, people don't watch old shows, but because it's hard to like organize that, you know. And I like the system they have in communities like Reddit. Well, they'll say like, hey, let's talk about, you know, let's do a group watch of this old show. There's ones on Twitter these days. You know, this guy I follow, Thaliarchus, will do like group watches of Legend of the Galactic Heroes, and they did like over the last like 2 years, or no, in the last year, because it was 2 episodes a week, and then now they're watching Turn A Gundam, and I think that stuff's really cool. But like, you know, you have to like really organize and mobilize a community around that. And I've thought about doing that on YouTube, like, you know, saying, hey, I'm going to make an analysis video of this show in 2 weeks. Watch it before then, you know. But it's hard to organize that kind of thing. And like, my writing is so, you know, all over the place. I never know what I'm going to be writing about in 2 weeks. So yeah, it's just like, I don't see value like in watching new shows other than in getting to talk about it with other people who you know have seen it. And even then, again, I think the conversation is at its least interesting when the show's still airing. Like a show like Kill La Kill, to me, so much of the conversation that was happening around the show while it was airing is like mind-numbingly uninteresting, like especially to look back on. You know, at the time people were sussing out all this stuff about like, what does the nudity say about the state of the industry or something like that, and it was just like all this stuff that doesn't really get to the heart of the point, which once you understand the whole point of the show, once the whole thing's over and you consume it all as one piece, and then you can look at each individual element and be like, oh, that's what that was, you know, oh, that's why that happened in that episode, because it represents this thing that we understand now that we know the whole story, you know. And the conversation just becomes so much deeper and more interesting that the stuff that was being said before doesn't even seem like it has a point anymore. And I feel like there's this huge danger that people come into when they form opinions about a show early on, and then, you know, start looking for stuff to back those thoughts up. You know, like when you've already formed your analysis of like what this show is like, and then you start missing out on other details that are, you know, leading you in other directions because you're so honed in on this central thing, that I think that can be a big danger to discussion as well, where it feels like some people are lagging behind, you know, what other people who just watched the whole show at once and got it are able to talk about. And we miss out so hard on like going back to things. Like so many people who are like, you know, making anime videos will talk about the flavor of the month stuff, and that's fine. But like, you know, I like getting the chance to do a video like Mob Psycho 100, here's why it's cool, in brief, you know. But like, I'd much rather see if someone like 3 months down the road comes out with a video that's like in-depth breaking down, you know, like every nuance in the storyline of Mob Psycho. Like if someone else made a 20-minute video that like explained the stuff I explained, but after really combing through the show and like getting everything out of it that could be gotten out of it, you know, because with me doing a video like that, like the one I did, which, I mean, is fine, because I probably won't do another video on Mob Psycho. I didn't feel that strongly about it, you know, that I would, like, want to dedicate that much time to it. But I think my video is inherently less interesting than what someone could do if they took the time, you know, if they wanted to do the 20-minute video. So for me right now, I really want to get out, like, lots of content in the near future. I want to have a lot of videos coming out. I've got a lot of videos that are lined up to come out. And, like, the idea of watching current shows, even just the first episodes, is like really unappealing to me right now, which is why I've handed off the Weebcast to Jeff, Mother's Basement, because he watches all the current stuff. So that's much more his game, you know, his bag, to watch all the new stuff and talk about it. So I've given it to him. Best Guy Ever still going to be on there just because he likes doing it. But like for me, it's like, even when I do those things, and I do think they're fun. I think it's fun to watch all the new episodes, to have at least some idea of what's on TV right now. I think that is helpful and healthy for me. But I don't think there's much rush. I don't think I need to know what's on TV this season when I can just, at the end of the season, watch all the shows to as far in as I can get, as opposed to like, at the end of the season looking back on these 15 episode ones that I started and going, well, I guess I'll, try to catch up on all these again. Like, and it sets my expectations weirdly because so many times the show I'm most excited about at the start of the season is not the one I'm most excited about at the end of the season. And that can be really bad for like my expectations, where for the whole season all I remember is how it had such a great first episode, and then once I finally catch up, then the rest of it's not nearly as interesting as that first episode was. I felt that way about Showa Genroku Rakugo Shinju in the winter. Like, I do think it's a good show, but it did not live up to the expectation I'd built up from those first 2 episodes being so good, which was like, it felt like a 9 out of 10 show, and I got something that felt more like a 7, and I ended up liking Konosuba more. Or from the spring season, Sancha Sanyo had like my favorite opening episode of the season, and then it kind of didn't go anywhere for the whole rest of it. And that one I had watched the first 3, and I liked the first 3 episodes, and I still felt like it didn't go anywhere after that. Whereas like Sakamoto, which the first episode I thought was good, but then the rest of the show blew me away, and it was like my favorite show of the year so far. So, yeah, you get the point. It's like this weird push and pull of expectations where I feel like it's healthier for me if I just watch the whole thing at once and then I immediately know what it's like. I don't have this whole, build up going on in my head over this long amount of time, And even if you're watching it week by week, the same thing can happen, where for that whole first week until episode 2, you're thinking about how great episode 1 was, and then if episode 2 is a letdown, then it's a huge letdown, which has happened before. And I've also had so many times where like with something like Zanko no Terror, where like the first episode was amazing, second episode was pretty great, and then I didn't keep watching, and then like I watched all my friends slowly sour to the show, and just every week they were getting more and more bitter towards it, and that actually had a negative effect on me in the other way, because by the time I went to watch the show, I'd heard so much bad about it that like I was just ready for it to be shit, and so like I just watched it with the mindset of like, I'm just gonna watch this so I can shit on it, and I'm terrified now because like last season I watched the first episode of Cheer Boys and I thought it was amazing, but then I didn't end up keeping up with it, and now I haven't heard anything about it, so now I'm like freaking out. Oh man, is Cheer Boys going to turn out to be a huge disappointment, or is it going to turn out to be good? I don't know. I'm much more enthusiastic about like the idea of some show I didn't even pay attention to and getting to just like binge it and find out it was great, I was so happy with Real Life earlier this year when the show came out and it was just all there, and I just watched the whole thing. There were no questions in my mind. There were no and that's the kind of show that if I had watched the first episode and then had to wait the whole season, I probably wouldn't have watched the rest, because the first episode isn't that impressive. And there's some shows like that where like I think the first episode's okay, and then like I just don't think it'll hold my attention for, that many weeks. Like, Tanaka-kun is always listless. Like, I watched the first episode, I thought it was and then I dropped it. And then, like, now that I've heard so much good about it, I actually want to give it another shot. But what if I had just, when the show is over, if I had just heard that it was good, watched that first episode and gone, well, I'll give episode 2 a shot, and then I would have been much more likely to then get won over and keep watching, I'm sure I've made a point in here somewhere, but just in general, I don't like watching current anime. I don't like talking about or forming opinions on current anime. I don't want to share my opinions on shows until they're over and I really have the full perspective on what it is. And I think there's so much better old stuff that you could be watching instead of getting strung along by all these shows every single week, watching fucking 30 shows because you need enough shows to watch in a week, even though half the ones you're watching you're not that into. Because I hear that all the time, where people are like, I just want stuff to watch, so I'm watching every fucking show this season. And I'm like, why don't you just watch the 2 you're into, and then go watch some, like, awesome 80s or 90s show or something, or early 2000s show? Why are you watching only the newest stuff when there's so much good that you could be experiencing? And then we could all have interesting conversations about those old shows, And something that's out already in full, you can talk about it forever. Like, it doesn't, because the show's over, doesn't mean it's, like, dead and buried and you can't discuss it anymore. You can dig it up forever, and it'll always be interesting. It'll even get more interesting because more people will have seen it, and the people who really care about it will have grown to care about it even more, you know? So, yeah, fuck current anime.